In this video, we'll talk about factoring using the distributive property. So real quick, let's recap. Distributive property would be if you have 2 times x plus 3, that would equal 2x plus 6. And essentially what's happening is that you're multiplying the 2 times both of these numbers. So in essence what we're doing is we're going to be looking at an expression like this and trying to rewrite it using the distributive property. So essentially we're undistributing here. So let's look at an example. Let's say we wanted to factor 5x squared plus 25x. Now, part of what we need to look at here is what do they have in common? Well, if I'm looking at the 5x squared, well, it has a 5 and it has an x squared. And the 25, well, that would be technically 5 squared. So both of these have a 5x in common that I could factor out. So hypothetically, if I pulled out a 5x, what would be left in the 5x squared? Well, just the 1x, because then I take the 5x times this would make my 5x squared. Very similar thinking here. If I was to divide by 5 and then by x on the 25x, what would be left? Well, just a 5, and it would be positive because of the symbol. And if very similar, if I take the 5 times the 5x, well, I get the 25x. So this would be my factored expression right here, and that's what they're asking for there. So you might be asking yourself, okay, why undo what we've been doing for an entire year almost? Well, it ties down to this. This is a very powerful way to solve equations, and it ties to a very simple mathematical concept, and they call that the zero product rule, or sometimes a zero product property, but either way it means the same thing. If I have two numbers, let's call them a and b, and I'm multiplying them, so if a times b equals 0, what I can then deduce is that a equals 0 or b equals 0. Now this can be very powerful when you're trying to solve equations. If you can write it as a thing times a thing, then I can say, okay, well, one of these two things must be equal to 0. And at the very least, it can make it to where I can narrow it down to two things that it could be. So let's talk about an example here. Let's say we wanted to solve this equation for x. I have 5x squared equals 25x. The first step, which would be fairly simple to see, is, okay, let's take 5x squared minus 25x, and that's equal to 0. We're trying to get all the x's on the same side. Now the problem is, I don't know how to combine x squareds and x's. I can't make it to where there's just an x on one side. Either way, I'm stuck with an expression with two kind of different x terms. This is where the factoring kicks in. Now we've talked about I can pull a 5x out of both of these things. So I'm going to write this as 5x times x minus 5 equals 0. So just to draw emphasis to it here, I have something times another thing equals 0. Let's call this our a, and this could be our b. Well, then I can say either 5x equals 0 or, and or is very important here, it allows for both cases, x minus 5 has to equal 0. The first thing equals 0 or the second thing does. One of these two things has to equal 0. Could be both, but this would at least allow me to limit it to two possible solutions. So if I solve now both of these ones individually, much easier to solve. This would tell me, I'll go ahead and just kind of draw it up here. I'm going to solve this one individually. 5x equals 0. Well, this would tell me if x is 0, this original equation would be true. And that would make sense. If I take 0 squared times 5, that's 0. And if that's 25 times 0, that's also 0. They'd be equal. Cool. Done. And then I'm going to do the other guy. So let's take x minus 5 equal to 0. Add 5 to both sides. X can be 5. And if I kind of take this and plug it in, well, if I take 5 squared, that's 25 times 5 again is 125, and then I take 25 times 5, that'd be 125, so it works. So ultimately my solution would be x equals 0 or x equal 5, and that would be one reason where the factoring really does tie in, and it's used a lot. This idea is bared down a lot when you're talking about high-level mathematics all the way up through calculus, this whole idea of solving for 0. Very powerful result in mathematics and a very simple concept at its core.